Hello everyone. The Biochemical Society and Portland Press are pleased to welcome you to this webinar, which is part of our Biochemistry Focus webinar series. Topics in the series include different research areas in the molecular biosciences, as well as practical sessions to support career development. Each webinar will give you the opportunity to ask questions via text, and we welcome suggestions for future topics and speakers to feature in our webinar series. Please see the website for more details. My name's Alice Robson, and I'm an Associate Professor in Biochemistry at the University of Bristol. I'm also a member of the Education, Training and Public Engagement Committee at the Biochemical Society, and I'll be chairing today's session. Today's webinar is titled Supporting Neurodivergent Students in the Biochemistry and Chemistry Classroom, Strategies for Success. And our invited speakers will be discussing common challenges experienced by students with executive function challenges and exploring practical strategies to modify course policies and create a more inclusive learning environment. We'll take questions at the end of the webinar, but please do send in your questions during the talks. If you have a question, please type it into the question box as shown in the image on the screen, stating which speaker your question's for, and we'll try to answer as many as possible at the end of the session. Our invited speakers today are Christin and Monroe from Landmark College and Dylan Sullivan from the University of Maine at Augusta. Christin is an Associate Professor of Chemistry and currently manages an STEM project for the Life Science and Computer Science program at Landmark College. She serves as a mentor for undergraduates for both science education and chemistry projects, and has an extensive background working with historically underrepresented groups in STEM fields, including low-income, first-generation and neurodiverse students. Dylan is the Neurodiversity Liaison and Student Success Specialist at UMA and has recently co-authored an article with Christin entitled Scholar Perspectives on the Impact of a Scientific Community Programme for Neurodivergent Undergraduate STEM Scholars. With the aim of bridging the gap between neurodivergent scholars and STEM, the paper highlights ways to facilitate internships and provide ongoing support through cohort activities and mentorship. So I'm now going to hand over to Christin to give her presentation.
Thank you, Alice. All right. Can you see the slide?
Yes, they look great. Okay. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, thank you for those wonderful introductions. I'm really excited to do this presentation today and to share the floor with Dylan Sullivan, who's a recent graduate of Landmark, but also a former student of mine as well, and now collaborator. So today, some of the key takeaways for this talk include understanding the impact of executive function challenges on students, learning strategies for modifying course policies to better support neurodivergent students, explore alternative assessment methods that can better reflect student understanding, and gain practical tips for creating a more inclusive and accessible learning environment. So as Alice mentioned, I teach at Landmark College. Landmark is in southern Vermont, and it was established in 1985 as the first institution of higher education to solely serve students who are neurodivergent. Originally, prior to the language development of neurodivergence, Landmark started off serving students with dyslexia and has expanded to serve students with other learning differences, ADHD, autism. Although a specific diagnosis is not required for Landmark, you could also have executive function challenges, which will be the focus of today's talk. When we talk about neurodiversity, I think it's important to recognize the difference between neurodiversity, which describes the whole bell curve. I have a bell curve on my screen. And when you talk about being neurodivergent, you're talking about the edges of the bell curve. And that can either be below or above average for different characteristics. That was something that I definitely struggled a little bit with the language to, make sure that I was using the appropriate language for the appropriate situation and differentiating between neurodiversity and neurodivergent. Another thing to highlight about this slide is that the world was designed for the neurotypical person, the person in the center of the bell curve, and that's why in some cases when you are neurodivergent, the world isn't designed for you, and so having accommodations to acknowledge that is really important. There are many models of executive functions. This is a model that I was introduced to teaching at Landmark called Brown's model, which was originally developed for individuals with ADHD. So executive functions are the cognitive processes that regulate an individual's ability to sustain self-directed action towards a goal. Learning about executive function challenges and how to recognize them in students was a big game changer for me teaching at Landmark. Being able to recognize the different places in which a student might get stuck along the process. And I think that Brown's model breaks it down in a way where you can see, if you're going through a process, where someone might get stuck. One of the jokes that I say is that, so a lot of my students have high activation energy, and I think talking to a biochemical audience, you might get that joke. But there's also other places in which a student might get stuck. I want to briefly just mention a non-academic example of executive function challenges, because we all experience executive function challenges. In part, they're tied to anxiety, but for neurodivergent individuals, it tends to be more amplified. So this is an example that is actually from my dad. My dad has been polishing stones as a hobby since he was in high school. So, you can estimate my age and then imagine how long he has been doing this. And so I asked him for an example of how he sees executive function challenges. He's not an academic. So he said, I really enjoy collecting rough rocks. He just got back from Tucson, Arizona, and came back with boxes and boxes of rocks. He really loves polishing the stones. That's something he has been doing forever. But when it comes to the metalwork and finishing the product, that's where he demonstrates that managing frustration and modulating emotions, because he is such a perfectionist and he's put all this effort into, picking the right place to polish the stone and all these things. And so if he was graded on the final product, he would not get a very low grade. The number of rough rocks that are in our house versus the number of finished products that ratio is very, very low. And that's something, that can translate to the classroom. I'm sure you've all had students that have worked on things in front of you and then not turn them in. And, you wonder, you're like, don't they understand that a zero is any grade above a zero is mathematically better. But one of the interesting pieces of that is that sometimes a student would rather get a zero with no judgment than turn something in and have judgment. Something also important to recognize about many neurodivergent learning differences is that the disability status of an individual is really environmental. And so there are times when a student who, say, has dyslexia may appear not to have a disability. But I think that it's important to acknowledge the disability in a very, kind way, to recognize that if you tell a student, oh, well, you're not disabled, in a well-intentioned way, you might actually promote masking. And masking is a sensible way to survive when you have no other tools at your disposal. The swan here shows what you see on the top of the surface, but there's so many things going on below the surface. And that sometimes when I'm working with students at Landmark, I won't see what's happening until they go off the rails. And sometimes it's unexpected because they're really good at masking. So creating environments where you welcome their differences and you allow them to show their true selves will end up helping in the end. And the other thing is that when we think about cognitive load theory, the idea that we can only hold 4 things in our head at the same time, or up to 4 things, if a student is masking, they're taking away from the load that they can use to actually engage with classroom content. So minimizing masking is also beneficial to create environments where students are able to maximize their content knowledge. Before I jump into strategies, I always start my presentations just with a disclaimer to say that this is not a wholesale fix-all. When you are engaging in creating a more accessible environment, you have to be authentic to yourself, because if you don't own it, your students won't own it, to your specific content and to the students that you're serving, because you know them best. And so I encourage you to think about ways that you can adapt the strategies that Dylan and I present today to your own environment. So I'm going to talk a little bit about strategies to support students with executive function challenges. First, looking at promoting activation and focus, lowering barriers for access. So one of the things that I will do is I will assign videos for homework assignments instead of reading. I give the students comparable reading assignments, and I encourage them to have the textbook open or have it, on a screen or in their hands while they're watching the videos. But having a place where all of the video content is embedded in one place can really lower that activation barrier. And we also know that, students not reading isn't limited to the neurodivergent population. There's been a lot of Chronicle of Higher Education articles that talk about students not reading. Another way is to utilize flipped classroom models and provide students with the time and space to do work during class. They are in that academic setting where they can focus. One of the interesting things is I can see students' grades in other classes, and without a doubt, when I look at a student's grade when they're struggling, I don't do this for every student, but when they're struggling, they'll have, a high 40 or 50 in my class, which is almost passing, but in other classes they'll have in the 20s. And some of that comes down to them really struggling with doing work outside of the classroom. So the more you can get them to do the work in the classroom, the more their grade really does reflect their content knowledge. Another way to sustain effort and modulate emotional regulation, to utilize automatic grading. At first, I was skeptical to use automatic grading, but I found that it works really well for students to get the feedback in the moment. AI can also be used as an accessibility tool to help students to organize their thoughts and scaffold assignments. And providing clear learning objectives that align with why are you learning this material can also help to sustain effort as well. In terms of leveraging intrinsic load to promote memory, giving students access to accessibility technology can be beneficial. Sorry, just trying to move. I can't move to see it. And when you are using tools that align with accessibility technology, you can have the student focusing on what is actually being assessed rather than them focusing on things that are not being assessed. And then allowing students to promote self-advocacy through identification of strengths and finding comparable work partners can also assist with memory. I think that something that we do as a society is we expect everyone to be perfect at everything. But the reality is that when you lean on strengths, it could really allow students to show how strong they are at managing their tasks. So this is an example of breaking down learning objectives and also what is being assessed. I think that one strategy that you can use while you are thinking about reasonable versus unreasonable accommodations is to think about what is being assessed in a laboratory setting and what is not being assessed. And so, for example, quote, reading the instructions is not part of the assessment, and collecting the data isn't necessarily part of the assessment. The things that are being assessed are interpreting instructions, performing labs, and analyzing data. I collaborate with some blind chemists who have tools that will read off instructions and data in real time to scientists. And this can be a useful tool not just for blind individuals, but also for individuals who have print-based disabilities like dyslexia. And allowing the student to focus on the things that are being assessed and be in the moment is a really key skill for them to truly demonstrate that how their grades reflect their content knowledge. When you promote environments where students belong and build identity, that can promote action. Another thing that I have noticed is that a lot of students have anxiety about turning things in. I alluded to that at the beginning of the talk. Allowing for draft submissions can really lower anxiety, and it actually lowers the sort of need for students to cheat, because if they have the opportunity to revise it, then they aren't as anxious about getting it done. I have found that I'm not inundated with revisions from students. I'll tend to coach them and say, you know, this is an assignment you probably want to revise. But what's really nice is the students are much more willing to turn in drafts when I give them that option. I also provide flexible deadlines and try to minimize penalties for soft skills, allowing students' grades to reflect content knowledge, which can be motivational. You know, at some point, a student gets so frustrated because they've lost so many points just because an assignment is late, and you know, ultimately that doesn't necessarily reflect whether they can do the subject you're teaching. In terms of time extensions, one of the things that I do is I have a suggested deadline, which is in line with the course content. 2 weeks after that deadline, I put a placeholder 0 into my grade book, and I basically tell my students that all grades are fake until the midterm. But the zeros are important because they allow students to see how they're actually doing in the class. If you don't put zeros into grade books, then students kind of get a false sense of security. And if there are academic intervention teams that are monitoring students, then giving them an accurate reflection of what their grade is also important. But making it clear to the students that it's fake, you can still improve it. And then the middle and end of semester cutoffs. And again, this can be adjustable to your situation. You could do the end of a unit. I have a mid-semester cutoff because I think it's important mid-semester to students to have an accurate reflection of where their grade stands. You know, there have been students that have turned in very minimal work by the middle of the semester, and then they say, well, you know, can I still pass the class? And having those realistic conversations with students is important. And sometimes, especially for students with ADHD, having that sort of that deadline is also important to make sure that they, you know, meet the needs. But in addition to that, the mid-semester cutoff is nice because sometimes students get so behind that they don't know which way is up. And so resetting mid-semester can also help them so that they aren't overwhelmed with all of the work that they've fallen behind in. So this is my last slide. I want to leave you with a question before I turn it over to Dylan. My first semester at Landmark, I had a situation where a student was requesting unreasonable accommodations. And the dean at the time gave me the advice that when you are tasked with determining whether something is reasonable or unreasonable, think about whether you are having this request is essentially moving the entire parking lot, something that is shifting the entire way that your course is designed, or whether it's moving a parking spot. And so the question I have for you is, what can you do to make your classrooms more accessible by moving a parking spot in your classroom? So with that, I will turn it over to Dylan.
Hello, everyone. So as Professor Monroe mentioned, my name is Dylan Sullivan. I am a former student of Professor Monroe and a mentee. So my goal in the second half of the presentation is to emphasize the impact the Landmark had on me in my journey prior and where I'm at now. Okay, so this is a timeline of my education, I started to go to school in Southern Maine at Cape Elizabeth. And I had a wonderful support system throughout high school. I was placed into remedial English. Oh, so for disclosure, I'm dyslexic and I have ADHD and I have some symptoms of ASD or autism spectrum disorder. So my mom is also dyslexic, and as soon as we started reading and writing, I was placed into a remedial English class. They never put me into a second language class because English was such a challenge for me. So I was in those remedial English classes up until my junior year of high school, and that was when I was formally diagnosed with dyslexia. So I got into the University of Maine in their chemical engineering program, and it became extraordinarily apparent, extraordinarily fast how difficult college was going to be without the supports that I had been receiving in high school. I felt guilty for being dyslexic at this large university. The professors didn't know my name. I felt embarrassed about asking questions in these large classroom settings, and eventually I had to withdraw. And I went into a depression. I was sleeping like 12 to 18 hours a day. And at this point, I knew I was dyslexic. I had been diagnosed with dyslexia, and my mom was dyslexic, and it's usually passed down from it's usually, yeah. And but I hadn't like internalized what it meant to be dyslexia, and I saw my dyslexia as an illness to overcome. Like it was not something I ever thought about working with, or I never saw the benefits of it. It was like I struggle with reading and writing, and I just have to fight harder to improve my proficiency. So I tried again after not doing well at the University of Maine, at the University of Southern Maine, and it was the same exact story. One semester, not understanding myself, and it's not that the supports weren't there, is that I didn't really know what it meant to be dyslexic. And then I tried it again for a third time at the Southern Maine Community College with the same results. So at this point, before getting to Landmark, my academic confidence was at an all-time low. Landmark truly was my last shot at a higher education, and then I was going to call it quits. I got to give myself a pat on the back for staying with it for so long. But Landmark truly had an extraordinarily uphill battle in overcoming even just the lack of confidence I had as a scholar, in academia. But yeah, we'll get into that. So being in the Landmark community, you're around other neurodiverse students, and they are, and I'm so grateful for this. A lot of them are like so open and accepting of like their neurodivergence, which made it easier for me to get to the point of accepting, okay, I'm dyslexic, and maybe it's something I can work with rather than against. And so I ended up being a campus ambassador and being able to tell my story to strangers routinely, like on a weekly basis, telling my story to strangers. And that was when the acceptance turned into, it was much easier to disclose at that point, but it took a long time to get there. Like the first 2 years, I still wasn't really accepting that I was dyslexic. And my plan when I came to Landmark was to get my associates and then just transfer out. But I found such a wonderful community and so many research opportunities and staff that were wonderful mentors to me. So I decided to stay. And then I ended up back in the University of Maine system as the neurodiversity liaison and student success specialist, which is the position I'm in now, helping other neurodiverse students navigate through college. Okay, next slide. So some of the challenges that I personally experience, I'm just going to go over briefly. I tried to come up with an analogy of what it's like to struggle with executive functioning, and I thought of two. I feel like it would be like every time you picked up your phone, you had a new operating system, or every time you had to drive a car, you were driving a new car, or it's like being asked to swim with winter gear on. It's like, yeah, I'm just trying to illustrate how challenging it can be some days. So reading and writing challenges, being dyslexic is, I'm constantly phonetically spelling. I have like the shapes of words memorized rather than, yeah, so reading and writing, decoding and encoding. Time blindness is something else that is an executive challenge for me, where I look at assignments and I don't really know how long it will take. And then instructions ambiguity, if the instructions aren't extraordinarily explicit, like step by step, I really, really struggle. And then I just wanted to mention that the intrinsic versus extrinsic load. If you look at executive functioning in that framework, you can do extraordinary things in your classroom to help alleviate executive functioning challenges. Next slide. Okay, so then my experience at Landmark, specifically in Professor Monroe's class, but I'll mention others as well. So Professor Monroe and I came to Landmark at the same time, and it was an evolutionary, not a revolutionary process for Professor Monroe to come to these conclusions that she has, and the expertise she's gained has been an evolutionary process. Like it is piece by piece, making small adjustments through student feedback to find what works best. So when she talks about the accommodations and the strategies that she implements, it wasn't as though she came knowing all this information. She slowly tailored her classroom to fit her students' need, which I think is a beautiful way of going about it. And one of the strategies that she uses is 15 minutes at the end of class. And that, it sounds small, but that was like a game changer in terms of taking care of the activation challenges I experienced with work. So we would have 15 minutes at the end of class to start our work. We're in a setting where everyone is working around us and Professor Monroe is still in the class. So if we have questions on the instructions, we can ask her while we're there. And that helped alleviate the time blindness. I started to get a better sense of how long the assignments were going to take, and like alleviate the ambiguity in the instructions if there was any. Which goes into my next point, which is the ability to revise assignments is like a direct assault on perfectionism in the classroom. I know that I can revise it, so submitting it as is frees me from all that fear that my work isn't to my own standards. And then I can recover safely. And I think that as a scientist, the ability to separate oneself from experimental results or even just assignment results is important. So I think like the main difference, or like one of the biggest differences from Professor Monroe's classroom that I experienced from the other school experiences I had, was that Professor Monroe wanted to help and wanted to understand what areas we struggled in to make the learning experience more fluid. And it was really, it sounds small, but it was so important for me, like having this background, which is not unique at Landmark, of being embarrassed about being neurodivergent and really struggling in academia, to having a professor who I knew I was neurodiverse, even if I didn't disclose, was extraordinarily beneficial in like the early years of my time at Landmark. And Professor Monroe's classroom is just one example of the models I've seen at Landmark. So I had a botany class where it was just presentations and experiments. Not even, some of the experiments weren't even graded, which I thought was a wonderful addition to the curriculum, to just have students perform experiments on their own and leave it ungraded. Really was a wonderful thing for me to explore my as a way to navigate the scientific method. Like we were also given quizzes the week prior that corresponded to reading. So we'd have the quiz that following Monday, and we already have the answers for it because we were given it prior, which I had never seen done before. But I could still tell you about the plants I was learning about in that class. And then the genetics class I had was just based on primary sources. We just worked with primary sources. There was one book that we read a few chapters out of at the start, but then we dove into primary source genetics papers and started in the deep end and then slowly broke down these papers over the course of the semester and gave presentations on them at the end. That's when I found out dyslexia is a polygenetic trait. But yeah, like evolutions class we had, we had oral quizzes, presentations, a lot of collaborative and lab practicums. So when Professor Monroe talks about considering what works best for your own students, I saw that was like the gold standard. You even saw huge variations at Landmark, which I think was wonderfully beneficial for the students. And and so when we're talking about serving neurodiverse populations, that if you think of that bell curve, we're aiming to capture the extreme ends of the bell curve. And by doing so, you capture the neurotypical students' experience as well. So by serving neurodiverse students, you're catering towards neurotypical minds as well. Something else I wanted to mention about the bell curve model. A lot of neurodiverse students will have what's called a spiky profile, which is they will excel in certain areas and then they are challenged in others. So my creative capacity is above average, but my reading and writing is below average. And that's a recipe for frustration. So a lot of times these it seems intuitive, but it's true that a lot of neurodivergent students can get easily frustrated just based on this imbalance in cognitive capacity. Okay, next slide. So then I wanted to talk a bit about the translated impact of what happened, my experiences at Landmark, into another university. So I interned I think it was either twice under Professor Monroe, or it was either 2 or 3 times. And through my experience at Landmark, from going from that zero lab confidence at all, I was built up to the point where I applied for a research undergrad experience and excelled in this larger university's biochemistry lab. It was the transformation to go from Landmark being my last shot at a higher education to exceeding my own expectations and performing assays in this large university is an incredible, it's hard to express just how much of a transformation happened. And the strategies I learned at Landmark, I slowly was able to internalize, which is the goal of a lot of Landmark's teaching. They teach you about how you learn, and slowly you're able to like, yeah, internalize these methods that work best for you, like finding like assistive technologies that you don't have to ask for. And yeah, I just wanted to list a few of the strategies that I use. Self-advocacy being number one. That is like the first day when I got into this lab, the PI handed me a book and asked me to read the book. And I was like, that, I didn't say it in these words, but I was like, that is not going to happen. So I asked him what was critical information for me to know, and then what was the most important, and then what was just good contextual information. And that, to get to that point where this scary PI hands me a book and I'm able to that I just met and ask that type of for that type of accommodation, or perform that type of self-advocacy, is an incredible transformation. And then once I have that information, I can use other strategies like the Crystal Palace method or body doubling, which is where you just sit with another person who's working, and it's a highly effective method of overcoming some executive functioning challenges. Using generative AI to rewrite assignment instructions is something that I've employed, and I've seen professors here at the University of Maine take their assignments and ask them to be clarified in generative AI to great effect as well. Chunking is a method of just breaking down larger assignments, like write a research paper on XYZ, and breaking that into like 3 assignments instead of 1 accumulative assignment. And something that Landmark taught me to do was to explore with what works best for me. Like, and I wrote 2 of them down, which is walking and talking my articles aloud. So getting my whole body involved and speaking the words. And I've even tried singing my textbooks to myself, which wasn't as effective, but I just thought I'd include it as an example of like the experimentation thing that I found myself doing at Landmark. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we'll kind of breeze through these 2. This I thought would just be a nice resource to show. It is, it's from Landmark as well, and across the top it has neurodivergent profiles, so ADHD, autism, auditory processing disorders, and language-based disabilities. And along the left column, it has areas where there's affect. So we got self-regulation, motivation, academic, and social emotional. And a lot of the times you can find solutions that cuts across profiles. Like, for example, extra time. If you see in the social emotional, in emotions, anxiety is present across all 4 neurodivergent profiles. And extra time, it doesn't matter the cause so much, but extra time is one example of like alleviating that symptom for all neurodivergent, all these profiles. So there are common solutions to varying neurotypes. Hopefully I made that clear. I'm not sure if I did too well explaining that, but next slide. And again, these are just some more ideas you could use in consideration of if you decide to take on this evolutionary process of creating a neuro-inclusive classroom. And these are things that you could even do yourself, like chunking, rather than trying to like terraform your whole classroom. Just starting with 1 assignment and making it a little slightly more neuro-inclusive, I think would be like the perfect place to start. But yeah, check-ins was something that Professor Monroe was wonderful about. She would even pull us in. she even pulled me in based on my challenges the year prior, saying that she knew I struggled this time last year, and so she pulled me into check-in, which is just I've never experienced in a higher education setting. So yeah, separate space to work, assistive technology, alternate forms of information, and extra time, as well as explicit learning outcomes. When it comes to explicit learning outcomes, I don't mean, I want to, like if you want a student to struggle through the research process, saying struggle through the research process as a learning outcome is extraordinarily beneficial for the student. I'm not entirely sure why that needs to be, why having that explicit learning outcome encourages completion, but I found when those type of when those types of learning outcomes are made explicit, it makes it easier to complete. It makes it feel more part of the process rather than like fighting against it. Okay, next slide. So yeah, now my current position, just to close up at University of Maine at Augusta, I am part of their neurodiversity initiative that they just instituted. And my personal top priorities at UMA are to create a sense of community here at Landmark. I feel like a lot of neurodiverse students really struggle with finding community. So that is one of my top drives right now. And a lot of the students are still processing their neurodivergence. They're at that early stage where I hadn't accepted my dyslexia. I find a lot of these students are there. So yeah, I'm continuing professional development, collaboration with my mentors, offering to be accountability partner and understanding friend for neurodiverse students, consulting with the Neurodiversity Initiative, and generating strategy ideas. Next slide. Okay. So that ends my end of the presentation. I'll pass it back to Alice.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much to both speakers. I think it's wonderful to see kind of both sides of the story here, to see it from the faculty and the student perspective. So thanks very much for that wonderful, well-rounded talk. So we've now got time to welcome some questions for the speakers. So if you have a question, please type it into the question box as shown on the image on the screen that you can see now. So whilst we're waiting for some more questions to come in, we've had one question come in, or more of a comment really, which was really agreeing with the point that Dylan was just making about the fact that adaptations can serve all students. So they say that the research that they've done suggests that the adjustments are needed for neurodivergent students, but they're often desired by neurotypical majority as well. So often these adjustments are actually beneficial to all students. And I guess that's been your experience as well, has it? That could be to either of you.
I would say yes. I think that, you know, it also just makes, as a professor, it just makes your life easier to, you know, think about those things. I was recently at another college and doing a presentation for helping them to create department policies that are more neuro-inclusive. And one of the interesting pieces of that presentation was they realized that they didn't need to, you know, they didn't need to reinvent the wheel. But the other really cool part was what we landed on was the idea that they had to figure out what their boundaries were and then create policies that took their curriculum to those boundaries. And instead of, you know, recognizing the boundaries after the fact and or adapting to an individual student's needs in that moment, being more reflective of their teaching. And the other piece is, you know, you can say no to things. And I think that Dylan made a really good point about acknowledging why things are, and being very clear about why you are doing what you're doing, right? So, you know, if part of the process is struggling through it because you're going to learn from that struggle, then be explicit about that. It's not a bad thing. It's not a secret that, science, you fail in science, and it's not a bad thing. I failed my first chemistry class in high school. I'm very open about that.
Great, we've got a couple more questions coming in now. One question is, can you suggest minor changes or adaptations that can be made in large classroom settings in biochemistry? Again, this could be maybe for both of you, but maybe Christin, did you want to start?
Sure. So I would say that the use of automatic grading technology is really great because you can have the students get that instantaneous feedback. It doesn't sound like a large class, but at Landmark it was. I think Dylan was actually in this class. I had 24 students in one class in a lecture, and I was running around all over the place when I had students working on independent work because everyone had questions. But when you utilize technology in that case, what ends up happening, and the student gets a sense of, oh, I tried something, that's the wrong answer. Now I'll raise my hand and I'll ask a question about it. I can help them narrow down their focus. I'm a big advocate for not penalizing students for trying an answer and just seeing if it's right and going through that process. But I think that utilizing that technology to help students narrow down their questions and also encouraging collaboration between students to work together to do problems can, really help. And, what I have found is that by using technology to do a lot of my grading, I spend less time grading, but then I have more time to, try new things in the classroom or do or spend the time with the students answering their questions. And so I think that technology can really help us even with large classes. Dylan, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think the 15 minutes that you incorporated at the end of your classroom is could be applied in a class of 200 students. It still amazes me how much of an impact that 15 minutes had in terms of reducing, pretty much eliminating the activation energy required for starting assignments. Whereas when I'm in my room trying to do it myself, it is a whole different ballgame.
So on that note, somebody's just asked you to clarify, Dylan, that 15 minutes, you mean that 15 minutes is a bit of time to start the assignment, so to start the homework, basically?
Yeah, so you'd end class 15 minutes early and ask the students to start their work in class. And it can be a collaborative effort as well.
Yeah. I was really interested with, both of you mentioned this idea of encouraging students to hand in drafts or having assignments which perhaps aren't graded, and that being a helpful strategy for neurodivergent students perhaps to get over this kind of perfectionism. Do you actually manage to get them to submit those drafts though? Because I have to say that my experience is often if you tell somebody that something's not summatively assessed, especially if they have executive functioning problems, they often won't do it, because unless they have that absolute, I have to do this and here's the deadline, they can't actually submit it. So how do you manage strategies to actually get them to submit that draft? Because I'd love to be able to get more of our students to do that.
So it's funny you say that, because for scaffolded assignments, I definitely find that where I'm like, okay, I'm going to walk you through this. And some of the students are like, I just want to do it. I just want to get the thing done and turn in the thing at the end of the semester. I don't need you to scaffold. So I'll go back in and I'll, excuse them from those grades. But when I use automatic platforms for grading, the students get unlimited attempts with no penalties. That really helps, especially if they start it during class. The other piece, though, is if they're working on lab reports or something that is a paper assignment, I try to get them to start it during class and get to a point where, they're ready to turn something in. And in some cases, I'll actually just stand at the door and I'll say, turn it in. I won't let them out. But in some cases, I'll actually tell a student, I'm like, if you want me to make a copy of this, I'm happy to go down and make a copy, and I'll hand you back the original, and you could feel like you still have the original, but I just want to see where you're at, because I think that that's a big struggle for me. I can't read students' minds, and so being able to see a draft, being able to give feedback on something can, help everyone, because then you're not frustrated as an instructor, like, why isn't the student just doing something? I sometimes I talk about executive function challenges like the static on a TV, that you just can't, you need to adjust the settings to be able to see the image behind it. But it's not that the image isn't there. It's not that the student doesn't have the ability. It's just that static is getting in the way.
Yeah, I really like that idea of doing it in class to kind of force them to do it, because often the ones that might say they don't need the scaffolding often do need the scaffolding, I think. Yeah. So another question has just come in. How often do you check in with your students throughout the academic year, and what methods have you found to be the most beneficial to collect that feedback? So is that via surveys, in-person conversations, and so on? So again, this could be for either.
I find in person is best. When I started at Landmark, we actually had 12-week semesters because of COVID, and then we transitioned back to the normal 15 weeks. So a lot of my classes were actually created for a 12-week semester. So I'm like, now I have 3 weeks of flexible time, which is nice, because then the students can I actually have built-in catch-up days where, if I'm feeling burned out, I know my students are feeling 10 times that burnout. So, giving them, it's like I get a break from teaching that day, but then they get the time to catch up. But on those days, what I'll typically do is I'll pull each student, regardless of whether they have an A or an F, into my class. We'll just have a quick check-in. I find that to be really useful because, you're not singling students out. I try to minimize, that like, oh, we really need to talk. I mean, I still have to do that sometimes. And in some cases, sending emails is good too. But I think that checking in and just getting that feedback in the moment is really useful. I'm not as good at going back and looking through surveys and, adapting my classes in that way. So that's a personal thing. I know for larger classes, surveys might be better. But I would say, one of the things at Landmark, we have 3 instances where we have to give written feedback to students. One is about 3 weeks into the semester. That's like an early alert notification, and then mid-semester and end of semester. So I try to like time it out so that those check-ins happen at those times. And another strategy that I use is I actually print out lists from our learning management system. I'll just print out all of their grades, and I'll highlight missing work. Because sometimes just having a list, especially if you have, some things are closed, giving the student, this is the list of things you should focus on, can really help them to overcome, that barrier of, oh, I'm just so far behind, I have no idea what to do. And telling a student just do everything and catch up is not helpful feedback, right? So yeah, Dylan, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I was going to mention that printed list. I vividly remember receiving those. They were critical in informing where I direct my attention. It was incredibly beneficial.
And I just had one other question, which was about you haven't talked very much about labs and whether you do any adaptations in actual labs, because I think often the practical laboratory work can be the most overwhelming for some of our neurodiverse students. Do you have any advice for how to make actual lab settings more inclusive for either of you?
Do you want to take that, Dylan, first, or?
Let me think. So I was in the unique position of being a lab assistant. So I would go through the lab prior to performing the lab. So I was kind of in a unique role where I got to see the labs before I performed the labs. And that really made the workflow. It was just a lot easier. Once I had the instructions, I got to read them prior, think about where everything was. So
being familiar with the environment in advance and the instructions.
Yeah.
I think too, I mean, I've seen, Dylan, you work with other students and sit down at the beginning of the lab and actually start reading through it before you get started. And so kind of organizing your thoughts. I think that I tend to not do long pre-lab lectures. I tend to just say, get started with it. And as you have questions, just let me know. And then that allows for time at the end for the students to get started on answering the questions. And I think that can work really well. I think, one of the things that we as chemistry professors think that we know where the pitfalls are, we know where a student is going to get stuck. My experience at Landmark is that it's completely unpredictable, and so I'm not going to sort of predict where a student is going to get stuck. I'm going to give them the opportunity to ask questions, creating a culture where you're able to ask questions. And one of the jokes that I have, I start off a lot of my labs, I'll hold a beaker in my hand. I'll say, okay, so I know a lot of you are worried that you're going to break something. I don't actually break the beaker, but I'm like, let's just break this beaker. And then, oh, look, we cleaned it up. Now we can move on. Last week, I had a student who was setting up a plant experiment, and he was really worried about it. He's like, I'm going to screw this up. I'm going to screw this up. And then at some point, he spilled all of the water and all of the soil all over the floor. And then all of the other students that were, it was actually my intern time. So all the interns just like assembled and helped clean it up and all worked together. And it was the most amazing thing, because I was like, that was the worst thing that could have possibly happened. And we all cleaned it up, and we can move on. So I think just creating a culture where, you know, it's okay to screw up, and, you know, don't get mad, don't get frustrated, just kind of say, okay, let's work together. And, you know, I didn't even ask my other interns to help out. They just all just came together. And so creating that belongingness and empowering students, I think that that's a big piece of it too. You know, having student leaders in the classroom that sometimes I'm answering another question, so other students will jump in and say, I know the answer to that question, I can help them. And just allowing that to happen and acknowledging that, you know, you can't always give the best explanation. Sometimes a student needs an explanation from another student. So those are all strategies that I think work really well in lab settings.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. We are just about out of time, so we're going to have to leave it there. But I'd like to thank everyone for attending, and particularly our two speakers. You can continue the conversation online. You can follow at BiochemSoc on Blue Sky and X. We welcome suggestions for future topics and speakers to feature in this biochemistry focused webinar series. And if you have an idea for a webinar in 2025, we invite you to submit a proposal for an upcoming webinar. So you can find more information about the webinars at our website, www.biochemistry.org. So all of our upcoming webinars are listed on the website as well. And if you've missed any of the 90+ webinars that we've already run as part of the series, or would like to watch them again, please visit our website or the YouTube channel, and you can see the details on the screen there. The recording from today's webinar will also be available to watch within the next couple of weeks. Finally, I wanted to highlight that it's more important than ever to stay connected and engage with your fellow molecular bioscientists. So do join the Biochemical Society's community of researchers and specialists, and take advantage of key benefits, including discounted registration fees for society courses and meetings, exclusive access to a wide range of grants and bursaries, and personal online access to 2 of their journals and more. So please do visit the website to find out more. So thanks very much to everyone, and goodbye for now. Bye.